Class 3, Attention. Neglect. In the last class, we mentioned that the parietal cortex may be important for representing where things are in space. So what happens if some regions in the parietal cortex are damaged? Damage to the right parietal cortex is often linked to a neurological condition called unilateral neglect, or sometimes spatial neglect, or just neglect. Though in fact, neglect happens after damages to other parts of the right hemisphere too, outside of the parietal cortex. But if one carefully analyzes the data from many patients, for those with neglect, the most common lesion is around the lower boundary of the parietal cortex, sometimes extending into the temporal lobe. So often this region is called the temporal parietal junction, TPJ. So what is this condition like? Patients with neglect due to damage to the right hemisphere will often ignore what goes on in the entire left visual field. Remember that the right visual field refers to the space to the right of the fovea, but often neglect also happens spatiotopically. That is, these patients ignore what goes on in the entire left visual space, regardless of eye movements. If we show a patient some figures and ask them to redraw it, they may do something like this. That is, they may only redraw the right part of the images, as if they never saw the left side. Of course, it is not just a matter of drawing. In everyday life, they may neglect what goes on the left side too. If you give them a plate of food, some patients may just eat the right half of it. It is a fascinating condition, and in fact fairly common, although usually the symptoms don't last for more than a few weeks after the lesion. So what is going on? We have talked about how the parietal cortex is important for space and action, but here the issue doesn't seem to be so simple. From these drawings, one may get a sense that they are not totally blind on the left side. Rather, there seems to be something wrong with how they attend to things on the left. One source of insight comes from patients with the condition of unilateral extinction, which often co-occur with neglect. In these patients, if you show them one thing on the left, they may see it. Often a doctor may wiggle her finger on the patient's left and sees if the patient can see it. Let's say the patient says, okay, it is seen. Then the doctor may wiggle her finger on the right and ask if the patient can see it. Let's say the patient can also detect it. Now here is the interesting thing. If the doctor wiggles her fingers on both hands, surprisingly, sometimes the patient will only report seeing the wiggle on the right. That is, the patient who wasn't blind to what's going on the left. It only gets extinguished when there's a competing stimulus on the right happening at the same time. The fact that neglect patients are not completely blind to what goes on in the left side is also supported by other fascinating studies. In one classic experiment, the patients were asked if these two houses looked differently. They said no, presumably because they couldn't attend the left side of the houses properly. But curiously, when the experimenter asked them which house would they want to live in, after some hesitation, they chose the upper one, as if they did know on some implicit level that there was something wrong with the house on the bottom.